I gotta download this. I think it's gonna run out of tape, electronic tape.
I was going to say, what tape?
Electronic tape, right? So the last verse we were on, I should go back up to it. This is really an interesting verse in 10. And remember, okay, this is still a section about the man born blind, except we've gotten to this thing about the sheep and the shepherd. So still the section, it's artificial. We noted that last week. It's an artificial cut, which was an incorrect cut, but, we got, well, you got to make them even, right? Kind of. So anyway, the hireling not being one who feeds the flock, the shepherd, of which it is not his own sheep, gazes on the wolf coming, and it sends away from the sheep and flees, and the wolf seizes them by force and scatters them. And I told you this is a very important verse in itself, because you've got the wolf who represents Rome, right? Which I think is obvious here. And I told you before that John was not only writing, I think, to Greeks and Romans. I think that's the big deal about John. But as we get to the end, a lot of the things that we are used to in the other Gospels have been accentuated. We get more information. And so John is giving us more information about all the circumstances. And also, this is later. This Gospel is later than the other Gospels, which, some people see that as a negative, but I don't see this as a negative at all. You have the early Gospels, probably the earliest is Mark. And we've looked at Mark. You see Mark, and then you see Matthew is probably the next one, and Luke is the next one. We think that all of those were written before the destruction of Jerusalem. And then we get John, that was written, we think, and I think I proved pretty well that it was written after the destruction of Jerusalem. But, around 90 AD, we're thinking. But the thing about John is you would think, what would you think? Okay, you got Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and I told you they're not synoptic, although we like to call them synoptic gospels. But, they appear to share, even to the point that people that are not very good with Greek, because if you look at the Greek, they're not similar at all. The Greek is different. But if you read it in a translation, what does it look like to you? They look similar, right? But that's only the translation. And so the idiots in the Tübingen school, which I think were the most disastrous school for both Lutherans and for the world, the Tübingen school said, oh, there's got to be the Q. There's got to be a Quella document that all these other documents came from. Well, what's really amazing is you go to John, the late gospel, and what do you expect? If there's really Quella, what would you expect John to be? A repeat, right? You'd expect John to repeat all the information before, and then maybe give you more data, but it'd be everything else if there really was a Quella, right? But does it? No, not at all. It's completely, I'm going to say completely different. It is expanding on the other Gospels. It's giving us more information at each point. And also it's late. So we get a historical irony in the statement before. The historical irony is this. Jesus says the hireling, not being the one who feeds the sheep, of which it's not his own sheep, gazes on the wolf coming and runs away. He runs away and flees, and the wolf seizes him by force and scatters him. What is ironic about this is that between the time of the earlier Gospels and this Gospel, the rabbis declared the testimony of the shepherd to be not acceptable, but the testimony of the hireling to be acceptable. And we believe we believe this isn't written in the Sanhedrin, this isn't written in the Mishnah, but we believe the reason is because the shepherds reported on what?
The birth of Jesus.
Yeah, and guess who those shepherds were?
Levites.
They were Levites. They had to be Levites because the only time that there are lambs in Bethlehem is for the Passover. That's where the lambs stay, in Bethlehem for the Passover. We know this from Josephus. And so all the lambs are gathered. It's that setup. Matter of fact, we watched The Chosen pilot. The Chosen pilot, have you seen that? It's really short, but it's about the disabled shepherd who brings the sheep. And it's a setup. None of the sheep are going to pass the match, except maybe the sheep that are kept by the Levites. But the Levites are keeping the sheep in Bethlehem for Passover, which means Jesus was probably born during Passover, of course, the 25th of December. Look, we ain't dummies. We stole it. We took that. We took that holiday from the Romans and the Greeks. I think it's wonderful. What a great thing. So we made it ours. But, it also fits what? In the calendar of the church. Isn't it kind of interesting? I mean, you would expect our calendar to be what? Based on? Based on the Judaic, right? You'd expect it all to be based in Judah. And remember, we did this actually. I spent way too much time on it, but I thought it was a really cool subject. Remember I made you that roundy dial where we could see the Jewish, year, and then we overlaid the Christian year on top of it. And it kind of fits really tightly. But it obviously, where did our Christian calendar come from? Not really the Jewish. Our Christian calendar came from the Greek festivals and the Greek festival calendar. It was kind of overlaid, but Easter, Hestia, Christmas, Mithras, all of our main celebrations. And I don't think it's a negative at all. I think we get all tense about the saints and stuff, but I don't think we should get so tense about the saints, because the saints were originally celebrated. Originally, the Greeks celebrated the pagan festival, right? So how bad is it for us to take saints of God and put them into the pagan festivals and change them to fit what we think is correct, right? And to think what God is correct. This is, by the way, how Christianity worked for generations through the, who are those guys? The Jesuits. The Jesuits would come into a society and interject Christ and Christianity into that society's religious structures and take over the religious structures. And it worked wonderfully across the world. It's a lot more effective than a lot of the other ways we do it. Like, for example, what's a common way, right? You come and you bring your church, you bring your Lutheran church into Africa. How well does that work in some places? Don't do it to the Middle East. What'll happen to you? Yeah.
Depends how much force they have with you.
Lutheran church in Ethiopia is bigger than it is here.
Yeah. My point, though, is if you want to be really effective, you don't go and you say, we know how to do church. You go in and you interject yourself into the culture, into the society, and make it part of that culture, of that society, of the people, right? And that's the way you're effective. As a matter of fact, I'll give you an example. One of the most effective ways the Anglican Church is moving into Central and South America, they used to go to the poor and try to bring the gospel to the poor, but that wasn't really effective at all. So they started to interject the gospel, instead of into the poor, into the upper class. Because guess what? They found in those countries that the poor and the middle class follow what the upper class do. So if you get the upper class groups to come to church and to begin, worshiping in the gospel, guess what happens to the poor and the middle class? Which is exactly opposite of what we mentally do in those countries. But the effectivity is like almost 1,000 times greater by going to the wealthy. But you say, we're not called to the wealthy. Well, sometimes the chosen in Matthew, I think, is so cool because Matthew is the wealthy, right? And you see, he's kind of tenuous, but it's interesting. I haven't watched a lot in it, but I think it's a really interesting show. But anyway, I thought, okay, this may be boring. You're probably going to fall asleep. That's okay. Get a good nap. But I thought it'd be really good to show you some of the Sanhedrin about this because remember, this wasn't written down to at least about 100 AD. Wow, only 10 years after when we think John was written. So they wrote down the Mishnah, they wrote down the Talmud. This is from the Sanhedrin Talmud, 26 Bravo B. And here's the stuff. If you can read the Hebrew, it's right like this. It goes from right to left, but we'll do the English. It goes from left to right. That's better, right? The Mishnah teaches that Rabbi Yehuda says, and by the way, I wanted you to see this because remember I told you this is much different than the Greek method. I'm not going to give you an example of Aristotle, but think about Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, the way the dialogues in the Greek work, or even the way the New Testament is written, right? That's what our Greek example is. Look how this works. The Mishnah teaches that Rabbi Yehuda says, when are all these people, gamblers and those who lend with interest, disqualified from bearing witness? It's a question. That's a question. It is when they have no occupation other than this one. Rabbi Abayo says that Rabbi Elzar says the halakha is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Do you see what they did? They ask a question, and this is very Greek in our sense, but how many questions are being asked, right? It's a single question, and then they want to give an answer, and look at the answers they give. It's from all these rabbis from the past. I didn't look up all these rabbis, probably in the Sanhedrin, they understand it. It continues. These are the source of the arguments. Rabbi Avao says that Rabbi Elzar says, all of these require a proclamation in the court. In other words, one is disqualified only after it's proclaimed in court that he was found guilty of this behavior. So if you're guilty of any of these things, what is it? Gamblers, those who lend with interest, you're disqualified from bearing witness if the court gives you a document or has a document that says you're disqualified. And then we get to the next statement. With regard to a shepherd who is also disqualified from bearing witness, Rav Ah and Ravina disagree. One says he requires a proclamation that he is disqualified due to his being a shepherd. One says he does not require a proclamation and is disqualified automatically. Isn't that interesting? Now, why would a shepherd be worse than a gambler or someone who lends an interest, right? Someone who breaks the Torah, basically. Look, if your historical brain should be immediately going, huh? What's the basis of this? Why is this? The Gemara asks. The Gemara is that's the there is no written Torah yet, but the Gemara, basically the Mishnah, the basis asks, granted, according to the one who says that he does not require a proclamation, that's what Rav Yehuda means when he says that Rav says that an ordinary shepherd is disqualified. He does not require a specific proclamation. So all these other guys, sinners, right, require a proclamation, but just being a shepherd, you're disqualified. But according to the one who says that a shepherd requires a proclamation, what is meant by the statement that an ordinary shepherd is disqualified? this is just very interesting historically. The Gemara answers, it means that an ordinary shepherd, the ordinary case, the court proclaims about him that he is disqualified having engaged in shepherding. If the court discovers that he regularly engages in this trade, it proclaims immediately that he is disqualified, and the court does not need to prove that he shepherds his flock in the fields of others. Okay. Who was the most famous shepherd in all of Israel?
David.
David! So David would not be allowed to proclaim in court. Interesting. Gemara recounts with regard to a certain deed of a gift on which the names of two robbers were signed. Rav Papa Bar Shamul thought that deed is valid despite the identity of the witnesses. The court did not claim about them and they were disqualified. Rav said to him, although it required proclamation in order to disqualify for a robber from bearing witness, is only in regard to a robber who is guilty of stealing by rabbinic law. With regard to a robber who is guilty of stealing by Torah law, we do require proclamation. He's disqualified automatically. So if you break rabbinic law, you don't require one. But if you break Torah law, we do have to have a proclamation. Or the opposite. Anyway, very interesting, right? The Gemara states a mnemonic for the following statements with regard to disqualification from testifying. Something and forbidden sexual relations and a thief. I want you to see this. This is just really interesting. Gemara's comments, the statement applies to, let's see, those who eat something else. A euphemism for pork. So if you see those who eat something else, it's euphemism for pork. And by the way, who are they that are going to tell us? Are disqualified from bearing witness. This is referring to those who accept charity from Gentiles. And of course, Gentiles, right? Thereby causing a desecration of God's name. They are tantamount to wicked people guilty of monetary transgression as willing to desecrate God's name for monetary gain. The Gemara comments, this statement applies with regard to taking charity from Gentiles in public. But if one takes it in private, he is not disqualified. And even if he takes it in public, we said he is disqualified only in a case where he can sustain himself by accepting charity from Gentiles in private. Despite this, he disgraces himself by taking it in public, but he cannot support himself by other manner. He is not disqualified, as is not his livelihood. Why do you think there's a big issue, a big deal with taking charity from Gentiles in this period? What's the deal? Tinodos.
I was going to say, you come in contact with Christians.
Well, Tinodos, right, is that group. It's the fifth sect of Judaism, right? And who have they invited in? Gentiles, right? And what does Paul say? Slave, free, man, woman, Gentile, Jew, right? And so what you have is you have this group of people that includes Gentiles, and what else does it say? You give to, you're giving charity, right? So who's giving charity? You got the Gentiles giving charity to the Jews and Jews giving charity to the Gentiles. It's part of Tinodos. It's that big deal, right? And so it has become a big deal in the sense of the Mishnah and the Talmud. Let's see, is there anything else here? I think I've got one more, maybe two more. I know this is sleepyhead stuff. Rav Naaman says, one who, due to a rumor, is suspected of engaging in forbidden sexual relations is fit to bear witness. Rav Sheget said to him, answer me, my master. The halakha is that one who is rumored, halakha is, by the way, the command, is one that is rumored to have engaged in forbidden sexual intercourse receives 40 lashes, and yet you say is not fair to fit to bear witness. In other words, they're punished, so why can't they? Rav Naaman concedes he is disqualified in regard to testimony about the status of a married woman. as he is clearly under suspicion in regard to this matter. I think that's about it.
So someone can spread a vicious rumor about you. It's not true, and you're forbidden from testifying.
Yes. But what's really interesting, I think there's one more statement down here. There's just really interesting things in this. You can keep going and you keep going and you keep going because this is what these arguments are about. Let's see, I think the final part is interesting in itself. This kind of brings it into the point, but you notice it said about rabbinic law and about Torah law. Torah law is the only law they're supposed to follow, right? Rabbinic law is the Mishnah and Talmudic kind of stuff. So you're really only held accountable to Torah law. The rabbinic law is what Jesus was kind of really irritated about, right? That's the thing. Rav Papa said to Huna, son of whatever, Yeshua, Rav Yeshua, that's Jesus. Not Jesus, but that's the same name as Jesus. But aren't they wicked people as they violated the Torah prohibition? Answer him, they assumed they were doing a mitzvah as they were burying the dead. That is grave diggers. That was the previous thing. But didn't I excommunicate them for this? They were doing a mitzvah, they were burying the dead. He excommunicated them. Nevertheless, they continued to bury people on the festival. Ravuna said to they assumed we were not excommunicated for doing something wrong. Rather, since the mitzvah of burying the dead involved desecrating the festival, the sages are achieving atonement for us, although our behavior was appropriate.
This reads like a text stream where you get a bunch of people and they're all weighing in on it, and
Yeah,
such person replied, and
it is.
This is the Old Testament Twitter.
Twitter.
The Old Testament Twitter.
Yeah, it's like a Twitter.
Actually, the New Testament.
Yeah,
is,
wrong
yeah.
period.
Yeah, well, Mishnah Talmud, right? The Mishnah is the oral Torah, and this is the commentary on the oral Torah, right? And I don't think I have the whole thing. I think the whole Steinholtz Talmud or the Talmud is like bigger than my bookcase, but I've got a lot of the books, and apparently don't tell anybody. They're worth, some of those volumes are worth a lot of money. I really need to see if I can collect the other ones, but I'm not sure I want to spend the bucks to do it. But, you know, it's a singular translation into English of the Talmud and the Mishnah. But a lot of this you can find online, which is really cool. And if you read the Hebrew, you get that. A conspiring witness who testified that a certain incident occurred at a particular time and a place, and then two other witnesses testify he was elsewhere at the time. I don't know.
Hebrew seems to be very succinct in the, I mean, if you can get that much out of that little bit of text that they have, it's kind of interesting.
Discuss the disqualification of conspiring witness from providing witness in another case. It was stated. Yes, there are abbreviations, there are magic things, there are little, you know, there are footnotes that reply to footnotes way back over here. It's really interesting. This is why it's a lifetime study in Hebrew, and this is what the rabbinic scholars, that's what they do. That's what their life was about. And that's why he who shall not be named, not Voldemort, that's Paul, Saul, he shall not be named, Saul of Tarsus, added to the Mishnah, to the Talmudic source. Anyway.
So you started all this talking about shepherds. Has anyone posited a theory on why shepherds were excluded?
Yeah. At the beginning, I mentioned we believe that the reason they excluded shepherds in that time, they don't explain why. It's not explained in the text of the Talmudic documents. It's one of those things. It's like you'll find in the Talmud later on where it talks about how Mary was raped by the Roman soldier, and that's why she was pregnant. You know, it was written actually 200 years, 100 years later than the earliest Talmudic documents. Well, you go, why is this in here, right? And there's another one that talks about Jesus being a sorcerer from Egypt. That's really interesting. He's a sorcerer from Egypt. I think that's really cool. So obviously he went to Egypt, learned how to be a sorcerer, and came back, right? Wait. Does that, it doesn't explain why are they talking about Jesus, this sorcerer from Egypt. It doesn't explain why they're talking about Mary being raped by a Roman soldier. You got to do what?
You got to accept that they existed.
Well, you got to fill in the holes, right? What's the hole to be filled in? The hole to be filled in is Matthew, Mark, and Luke telling us that Mary was a virgin who conceived, which is, oh, by the way, from Isaiah, a virgin, an unmarried woman will conceive and bear a son. Okay. And then, the thing about the shepherds, we don't know why they put it in there. We believe from other textual sources and other information that they put it in there because, and I think Origen writes about it, one of those early apostolic fathers, we believe it happened because when the shepherds went, the Levitical shepherds went and broadcast to everybody that what? We saw.
Angels. They said the Messiah is here.
And they said the Messiah. Yeah. So therefore, what do you have to do? You have to discredit them in law. If you don't, what happened?
You have to accept their testimony as true.
That's right. Because the law says what? The testimony of 2 or 3 is enough. Not 1, 2 or 3, which is interesting, right? 2 or 3. So guess how many shepherds you got? Well, obviously more than 2. And they all came and they proclaimed that we saw the angels proclaiming the Messiah.
You have to utterly destroy them. If you don't like what they're saying, just utterly destroy them.
So I have to, in the Talmud, I have to make, who won out? The Pharisees. How many Sadducees are there? There ain't no Sadducees. Matter of fact, the priest class, everybody calls themselves Cohen because Cohen means priest in Hebrew, right? But how many are there? Well, guess how many pure Cohen came back from Babylon?
0.
Yeah, 0. The only Cohen you got are the ones that were left in Samaria. Maybe. Right? It's only where the only real blood is. You have a broken chain. And so even though everyone, when everybody started taking last names in the medieval period, okay, what's your last name? Cohen, right? Yeah, because, everybody wanted to be. Because guess what they did when they came back from the Babylonian era, and they didn't have last names, but they wanted to be, Ben Cohen, because what happened at the end of the Babylonian period, if you weren't, they kicked you back to Babylon. You remember that? They kicked you back.
I just read Ezra and Nehemiah, and they, in the census in both books, it records that they brought a bunch of people with them who couldn't prove their ancestry, but they let them come back anyway.
Most of them, but it said that matter of fact, they removed whole families from the men, which is really interesting because the Jewish thing goes to the woman. In Ezra and Nehemiah, it says they kicked them out, kicked the families out, kicked the kids out, kicked the wives out. Yeah, I don't have the thing here, but that's basically what they did. And by the way, I think that's why it took them an extra 50 years to rebuild Jerusalem. Remember, the thing they did is, first of all, when they came, they kicked everybody out that wasn't pure, but no one was pure. And then the Samaritans, everybody came and said what? we'll help. And they said, boot you. And then they had problems. Well, yeah.
Oh, are you talking about the men who took foreign wives once they came back to Israel? Because they made the foreign wives and children leave, but the men got to stay.
Yeah, foreign wives, and yeah, where did they leave to? They went to Babylon, back to Babylon. The biggest problem they had, they believed, matter of fact, in history, the big thing is that I believe in the early synagogue. Early synagogue means the rabbis started kind of early. Many people don't believe that there's late synagogue. Late synagogue, they believe that the rabbis and the Pharisees started with Babylon. I think they started earlier than that. And one of the biggest preachings, they were preaching about why they had the destruction of northern Israel. And the destruction of northern Israel was caused by the fact that they had not retained the kingdom, and the northern Israel had not followed the correct principles that God had put down, right? That was one of their big deals. Well, what was the reason for the destruction of the southern kingdom? The southern kingdom, they said, was destroyed because, and also the northern kingdom, because they failed to clean all the foreign bad guys, all the other believers from the land. Now, in the Maccabean, past the Maccabean period, in the period of Christ, why did they say there was a problem? Because they proselytized. Coming out of Babylon, there was a huge movement in Pharisees, the Pharisaism, Pharisaic, out of the Maccabean era to proselytize. And guess what happened when they proselytized? Well, first of all, they invited the Romans in, and the Romans said, what about proselytizing? You can't do it. And so guess what? There was this huge thing, and one of the things that really irritated the rabbis about Paul and Hodos, remember your Acts? It doesn't say it, it's between the lines. What really irritated them about what Hodos was doing? Hodos was proselytizing, and they were having great effect. And the rabbis believed that their proselytization, going out to the people and trying to get more people into the Jewish faith, is what caused the Romans to come and cause that failure. So at each failure, or each, instead of believing that the people caused the problem, what did they believe? Christian. Well, not just Christians, but they believed that the things following God, right? That not following God in doing certain things, or following God in doing certain things, ended up with them having problems. Which, if you read the accounts, I think it's totally obvious it was the people and what they did. It's like, okay, so, why did the northern kingdom get whacked? Because they weren't following God's law. Why did the southern kingdom get whacked? The same thing. Why did they get whacked when they came back from Babylon? They weren't following the laws of God. Why did they get whacked from the Maccabean era? They weren't following the laws of God. When your high priest isn't even an Aaronite, right? So anyway, it's really an in-depth problem. And it's not a problem of the Jewish people, it's a problem of what?
Humanity.
It's a human problem, right? It's just the Jewish people get a better guide than we got it. Our Old Testament, our Torah, and our New Testament, it tells us everything. It tells us history, it tells us natural law, it tells us all this good stuff. But what do? Yeah, we got Senate stuff happening. It's really interesting. Anyway, and it's called Gomorrah. We're living in Gomorrah. Let's see what to see. The man runs away because he's a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. Okay. Why this is interesting is already the irony of the shepherds. Okay, for it to be written down in the Talmud, it already had to be what? Promulgated in the oral Torah and the Talmud that was oral at the time, because it wasn't written down until at least 100 AD, maybe later. Depends on who you believe. If you believe in the Council of Jamnia, which, by the way, good old Martin Luther really believed in the Council of Jamnia, and about 100 AD, they wrote down, we do know they wrote down the Babylonian Talmud, and they wrote down the Jerusalem Talmud around 100 AD. You know, it took them more than that to write it. It took a while, but it was written down at that time. Okay? And we know the Council of Jamnia because that's what Martin Luther said used to get rid of the apocryphal documents. He argued that the apocryphal documents, all the documents that were not accepted by the Council of Jamnia had to be put in the Apocrypha. The New Testament was all excluded by the Council of Jamnia, so he should have said those two. No, he said there were 5 there, right? Hebrews, 2 Peter, Revelation, Jude, and James. Yeah, so he didn't like, there were 5 he didn't like, and he actually put them in the New Testament Apocrypha, but we disagreed with Martin Luther and put them back in. But anyway, but remember, this about the hireling is Jesus, okay. Jesus is talking about this before it could be, you know, the shepherds could be excluded. He was talking about this. However, John is recording this. Why do you think John is recording this as such a big deal? Of all the things Jesus said, why do you think this is a big deal? I think it fits within the context of his logos to telos. That's the most important thing. But I think the reason it's a big deal is because it's on the minds of the people right now. When the rabbis said the shepherds can't be trusted in their testimony, what do you think happened in Jerusalem? That's kind of like saying a lawyer can't be trusted in their testimony in America today. What would happen? There'd be an uproar. Of course, it never happened because all the politicians are lawyers. But I'm just saying, you know, if we had a rabbinic group that said, you know, you can't trust the testimony of a lawyer, which may be true. No, I'm not. I'm just kidding. But you would have an uproar.
Shepherding strike.
A shepherding strike. Yeah, that would be a problem, right? Because that's where you get most of your meat. Anyway, the hireling fleeth because he's a hireling and careth not for the sheep. This is an irony. It's an irony in time. It's an irony in history. It's really interesting. That because a hireling, a misthos, is, and no or not, he cares about, is concerned with milei to him through all over the sheep. Because it is a hireling and he himself cares not about through all over the sheep. I don't know, I have a closed caption there. Anyway, and here is the beautiful statement. This may be another reason why the rabbis had to say that you can't trust the testimony of a shepherd. Because in the next statement, I am the good shepherd and know my sheep and are known of mine. Remember, this is still the context of the man born blind. Ego, imi. I am the one who feeds flock, the shepherd, not the hireling. The kalos, the beautiful, well or good, and gisinko, not gnosko, not I see, but I know through personal experience. This is, okay, one of those words, like, you know, we have stare at, see with physical eyes. This is the word that means to know through personal experience, as opposed to seeing with physical eyes or staring at, right? But yet we translate all these words to know. But this is to know through personal experience, the, Emma, my or mine, and they know through personal experience, me, my or mine. In other words, you have to see them. This is what is really important about this, because we're coming from the whole statement about the man who was born blind, and he was born blind, And yet, what did they say about it's the Pharisees, Jesus' Pharisees. And the Pharisees said, does that mean we're blind too? And Jesus said, yes, you are, And so this is our hope. This is the hope that even if we are born blind, even if we can't see with physical eyes, wait. You mean that we can know through personal experience Jesus without having seen with physical eyes or having stared at? This is what is really important. Why? This is the late gospel, 90 AD. And who is it written to? I think it's written to the Greeks and the Romans. And so the Greeks and Romans, how many of those guys saw Jesus? Yeah, maybe none of them. I mean, there may have been some who did, right? Maybe some were in the cohort. Maybe some were in the legion. Maybe some were part of the government. But the chances are really, really low, right? That any of the Greeks or Romans, what do they want to hear?
They're
What?
not excluded.
Yeah. And by the way, I think that the whole thing of the Gospels is non-excluding, right? It's calls all people, right? In the cosmos, in the creation. Anyway, I think this is just so beautiful. I am the beautiful, the well-good one who feeds the sheep, the shepherd. And I know mine own through personal experience, and my own know me through personal experience. This, I think, is one of the most important verses that you can get, especially since he says, I am, right? I am. And it doesn't just say he's the one that shepherds the flock. He's the one who feeds the flock. This is huge. Starvation culture, forget the starvation culture. We're not just talking about feeding, like physically feeding, even though, right? What is it? It's Greek. It's totally concrete. So yeah, it's feeding. But guess what we got coming on here, right? What we just did today, communion, Eucharist, right? Feeding the flock. And by the way, we had this before. I've got this about the sarks. Anyway, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. Now let's see what this says in the Greek, because the Greek, it's going to be a little different. As the Father knoweth me, even so I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. Kathos, just as Gasinko, he knows, that is, knows through personal experience of me, the Father, of and I, Kego, of and I, Gnosko. I know through personal experience the Father and the psyche, the mind of me, I place in behalf of the sheep. Just as the Father knows me, and I know through personal experience the Father, and my mind I lay in behalf of the sheep. The three parts of the human body, soul, according to the Greek, sarx, psyche, pneuma. He's going to talk about, he already did a little bit about pneuma with Nicodemus, but we're going to get more pneuma later. Because before, and I got it right here. And I tell you some things. I'm not trying to be provocative, but I think this is an intentional mistranslation of the statement. It loses a very critical and important point about Jesus that Jesus and John are making. Jesus is making this point. John is recording it. They look back at 651. This is a literal for 651. I'll go down to the translation. I am the living loaf, the bread. Remember, it said, I am the shepherd. I'm the one who feeds the sheep. Jesus before in 651 said, I am the living loaf. That from out of the sky, the one that's God's but not of God, having come down, in case that anyone shall have eaten from out of it, of the loaf, he will live into the age. And but my flesh is the loaf, which I will give in behalf of the life of thee that which was created. This is super important. In other words, in 6, Jesus proclaims that he is the loaf, sarx. He is the bread of life. You know, we translate the bread of life. It is. He is the fodder for the sheep. Now, you can take this any way you want. You know, obviously, the concrete explanation is what? The Eucharist, right? We take the wafer, we eat of the body of Christ, and we say that is the real presence of Christ. Guess what? The Greeks are thinking the same thing because it says ego imi. I am. That's concrete. And then it goes on and it says, I am the one who feeds the sheep. Wait a second. Am I saying that 6 and 10 are all connected? Well, Shazam is a logos to telos. The whole thing is a logos to telos that is telling us about, that is historically giving us Jesus' words, an explanation. And do you see how powerful and you know, I just hit, you know, that's why the intentional mistranslation, why they do that this way, because they don't want to confuse us, right? We don't want to confuse you with about suke, because if we had to tell you about suke, you'd have to do what? Understand about the mind and unconscious breath. And boy, that's really complex stuff. It's a lot easier for the Anglo-Saxons. We'll just throw in, he lays down his life. But what part? The Greek would say, well, is that sarx, suke, pneuma, all three, right? It doesn't say zoe. Zoe is life, life element. Anyway, I just think this is amazing because, and I'm kind of repeating a little bit, but that's okay, because the author is repeating this. My flesh is the loaf which I will give in behalf of the life of that which was created, compared with my mind, I lay in behalf of the sheep. In Greek, these are radically different thoughts, ideas. If you remember sarx, suke, and pneuma, the three elements of the human being, Jesus has declared that he is willing to give up or lay down his sarx and his suke for humanity. It isn't just life, it's the very flesh and core of his mind. In addition, it is his mind that he is sharing with these people. It's not just feeding you from his flesh. He's feeding you from his mind, the thoughts, the ideas. You know, it's the gospel, I think, is very simple and simplistic in some ways. But as we dig into it, right, what's the whole point? What do we say this? We say, you know, we're saved, but then the whole point of your Christian life after your salvation, right, is what? To grow, to learn, to understand. And guess how you do that? You know, what do we say? Lutherans, good Lutherans say, well, you study the words, you pray, you go to church, you take the Eucharist. Well, where'd you get that from? I mean, this is right in here. This is our shepherd, the shepherd. He feeds us with his mind, with his body. You know, I think this is really powerful stuff.
No, it's justification, sanctification, glorification.
Yeah. That, you know, yes, it is. That's the words I was looking for. And that's exactly the point, right?
Yeah.
And how do you do it? And by the way, we're not done. We're not done. We're at 10. There are 20 verses. I'm sorry, it's going to take us another year or two to get through John. I hope this is still exciting to you because every time I turn a page, every time I look at this, it's more and more exciting to me because as I dig more out of the John and the Greek, you know, it becomes more real to me, especially with this guy Jesus, who says ego imi. He doesn't say necessarily ego imi the Christ, although he did to the Samaritan woman and basically left her with that, right? I am. You know, we expect the Messiah, the Christ, uses both words. And he goes, I am. Right? I mean, coolio stuff. He goes on, I have other sheep that are not of the sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice. There'll be one flock and one shepherd. The other sheep I have, which are not of this fold, them also must I bring, and they shall hear my voice. There should be one fold and one shepherd. And all other things, contrariwise provided something which for his sheep. I hold who, which, or what it is from out of among of a courtyard of Heshiat, and that one there, it is necessary me to lead, bring, carry, and of the phonus, the tone of me, they will hear, and they will cause me not be one flock, especially sheep. Heis, Pullman, one that feeds flock, okay? And contrariwise, I hold sheep, which is not out from among this courtyard, and that one there, it is necessary I lead, and they will hear of my tone, and they will cause to be one flock, one who feeds the flock. All right. Do you see who this is talking to right now? I mean, I think it's obvious who it's talking to. The Church of Latter-day Saints believes it's talking about the people in the New World, which never existed, that supposedly came over in the 2 tribes of Israel that were the, what's that?
Native Americans, according to them.
No. Actually, they believe that they kind of died out. If you look at the Mormon documents, right? The 2 tribes were supposedly integrated to a degree, but they died out, and that's why you can't find any of the cities, any of the lands, any of the times, any of the places, and they weren't. They want to disassociate them. They wanted to disassociate themselves from the Stone Age people that were found here. Why? Because they're basically racist. You know, it's a racist group. They for a long time didn't include, people from other countries and other lands and other places, because they believed that they were the sovereign whatever, and they believed that all the other tribes, the 2 lost tribes, had died out in North America, but left that information for the future. But they were supposed to be the other sheep. Okay, but they're all gone. Well, what do you do with that? But the big deal here is, who did I say John was probably writing this gospel to?
Yeah, Gentiles.
The Gentiles, right? The Romans and Greeks. And what does it say? It doesn't say, you'll know me through personal experience. It says, they will hear my tone. This whole section is about knowing Jesus without seeing him. Matter of fact, how do I know that? The man who was born blind, did he ever see Jesus before he was healed? Never. Remember, Jesus sent him off with mud on his eyes, right, to the pool of Shiloah. And after he come back from the pool of Shiloah, he went to the Pharisees and they said, who healed you? I don't know, right? I never saw him with physical eyes, right? And then when Jesus calls him, it's obvious that I think it's obvious he recognizes Jesus' voice, right? And he knows that it was Jesus who healed him. And then we get that whole pointed section, and then we get the question to the Pharisees, or the Pharisees' question. Does that mean we're blind? And you'd think by the answer there's no hope, right? What is this whole thing giving you? It's hope.
You can hear, you can start listening.
Yes, sir.
Well, he said earlier, was it when the Roman soldier came and said, my son is dying, and he sent him away with, your son will be well. And he goes away without knowing for sure, but he trusts. And then he says, blessed are those who trust without being seen. That was earlier.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of what he's saying here. You have not seen, but you still trust.
This is in John, and you're picking up the point here, because you're right on the money. Remember the first, in fact, we're going to have it in the scripture today. Even the sermon. I won't give it away, but this is a light of mine. You get to sing it. Anyway, the whole thing is from John about the light. Remember, in the very beginning of John was about the light. And so the light was a light to the Gentiles, right? That's what it says. Holy smoke. So, that's the point. And do you see how this logos to telos? I mean, it wasn't enough for one of the Simeon, one of the signs to be, and by the way, it wasn't, it was a royalty. We had decided it was that royalty that had come to Capernaum to find the rabbi of Capernaum, Jesus, right? And he said, my son is dying, will you heal him? And he went away, he went away and, they met him on the way back and his son was healed, right? Your son is alive. Your son is healed. So, the big deal here is this is a buildup. It's a buildup, right? And the whole buildup is about not seeing, but being able to be convinced about Christ. Yes, sir.
Well, it's just like when a lawyer is laying out his case in front of a jury, he's going to present a whole smear of evidence, and any of that evidence is going to be relative to the final conclusion. So these are all just pieces of evidence that John's laid out in advance. He's put them in that position in the story instead of later, just because you need to know that at this point, all that stuff I presented you before.
I think that's well stated because remember, we're talking about historical evidence here, right? The historical evidence is the proof text, and that's how, in a court of law, we convict you or don't convict you. And so if you want, this is like, I love Josh McDowell's, evidence demands a verdict. I think he takes it too much to the legal or the lawyerly standpoint, but still, it's really a great thing to read. But that's exactly what this is. All ancient documents in the Greek like this are a logos to telos, a logical argument to telos. The fact that we don't know that or don't see that is our fault. Because either we're not reading in the Greek, which we're trying to do here, get that feel, right? And even then, we're missing points. It says, Anne pointed out to me, there are a few things that she noted that are parallels or allusions, in the text. And I try to get all the allusions I can from my textual sources, both apocryphal and the regular ones. But there are others. I was just thinking about this today. There are so many allusions, like, for example, to light or to Isaiah or other places. And, if you were to pick them all, you might be, every verse you'd probably have, a huge rabbinic source, right? And we don't even touch usually the Talmud much. I try to bring in the Talmud, the Mishnah, and the other sources. But even if you bring those in, right? If you bring those in, you could have 1,000, 5,000 pages worth of information, in the singular John, which is, 21 chapters and just not that many pages. But the point is this, the overall logos to telos, the telos of this, I think, is to the Gentiles, to us. How can we know Jesus when we haven't seen him physically? And by the way, we're going to get old Thomas. Isn't Thomas in John? I think it is, right? Old Thomas, doubting Thomas. I think it is. But if it isn't, we'll see. We'll see how the John hit.
I'm pretty sure.
I think it is, isn't it? Yeah. Because that is the question, and at the very end, they want to remind us. Thank you, Father, for your word. We pray you look at us this week. In your name we pray.
Well, and it's a message to us 2,000 years later who haven't seen, but we still need to trust.
Oh, yeah.